And good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's on the call. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today at our Good Governance Part 2 Leadership, Governance, and Culture Change webinar. Based on the overwhelming response we had at the governance session at this year's Roundtable, Capital Plus Exchange, SBBN, and the SME Finance Forum are proud to present the second in a series of webinars on good governance that begins to answer many of the questions raised by bank CEOs at this event. This webinar is presented by Peter Hinton, an SBBN expert with 21 years experience in countries across Asia, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Peter is an associate at Syed Business School, and he is an internationally recognized entrepreneurial leader who's invested in and transformed emerging market financial institutions and banks to improve performance. We also have joining us today Creative Métier, a consultancy supporting financial institutions to address critical challenges relating to organizational development, strategic HR, senior leadership development, and executive coaching. Creative Métier specializes in supporting senior leaders in their institutions, which often operate in highly complex environments to resolve the most challenging issues they face. Today we have with us Glynis Rankin, the CEO of Creative Métier, who has over 20 years experience operating in the finance sector. She has worked with global microfinance networks, regional national banks to provide organizational development and governance support over many years. Jessica Stewart is also joining us today, and she is the head of Innovation and Partnerships who has led organizational development and strategic HR consultancy support to Creative Métier's clients working in the financial inclusion space. She is currently leading a cross-bank mentoring program to accelerate the development and products for the women's market.
Very good. Thank you, everybody, and welcome to this second seminar on governance. If you remember, the last one, webinar 1, which is still available through the SBBN network, if you want to listen to that, looked at attracting talent to boards, the mix between independent board members and shareholder members on a board, board performance, how one assesses that and takes action in the light of that assessment, and how one looks at strengthening boards. So that's what we looked at in the last webinar, and today we're introducing the process of how to support chairs, board members, and CEOs to think about these key areas and the importance of having a well-defined culture, how boards can function optimally in line with the organization's culture, identifying the process for structuring and training board members as just normal best practice, achieving diversification of board membership and board rotation and succession planning. And as Jessica says, I'm very grateful that we've got our friends from Creative Métier helping us with this so that we can draw on their expertise as we look at governance in this second webinar. Before we go into the detail, we have a poll question. So Jessica, back to you.
Great. And so what we'd like to find out very early on here is whether or not you have a succession plan in place for board members. So this is a very easy poll. So the answer is either yes or no. And so please feel free to take a minute here. We want to see if you have a succession plan in place. We'll take about 30 more seconds here. And we are getting quite a few responses coming in, so we'll take about 20 more seconds here to answer. So thanks to everyone who's answered. So please do let us know if you have a succession plan. And we'll take about 15 more seconds. We're in a dead heat here, Peter. We've got 50% yes and 50% no as they're coming in. So we'll see if they... So we'll take about 5 more seconds and we can go ahead and close the poll. Great, and so we have a good percentage of institutions that do have a succession plan, about 57% do, and 43% are saying no, they do not have a succession plan in place.
Okay, so we've still got the majority do, but it's still a significant proportion that are not at this point in time. Don't have a succession plan in place. Is that right? Very good. We'll come back to that aspect of improving governance and how succession plans do play an important role in improving governance. But before doing that, let's look at where we are today. If you remember, the Istanbul Forum came up with 55 questions that you, the participants in the room, had at that point in time. We tried to address 53% of them in the last webinar, the one I referred to earlier, part 1, and now we're looking at the other 47%. So the key areas we're going to look at are the importance of culture, optimal functioning of boards in line with culture, and then optimizing board performance through best practice. And within that, we're going to look at these 5 key areas: defining what that culture is and the board's role in relation to the culture of an organization, attracting the right talent to the board, building the board, managing the board, and renewing the board. Having a clear culture, what I wanted to draw attention to is Jim Collins's book Built to Last and the other book Good to Great. If you've read those books, you'll be familiar with his whole statistically based analysis of many companies in America where they drove into what made really successful companies successful. And what they found was it wasn't the GE Capital businesses, the Coca-Colas were the really truly financially profitably successful businesses, but it was ones which had a clear vision, mission, and values. And in particular, what they found was it was value-driven organizations and organizations which had a clearly value-driven culture that were ultimately more successful than organizations that didn't. Drawing a clear example from Merck, Merck had a mission and value statement all about making the world a healthier place. This was what got people out of bed in the morning. This is what motivated the staff to actually improve the health of the world. It wasn't making profits, that was a byproduct of what they did. It wasn't being efficient, that was a byproduct of that value-driven culture. So the question to you participants and to all of us is, in running our organizations, what is getting your staff out of bed in the morning? Have you clearly defined what the vision, mission, and values of your organization is? If that's clear, then out of that comes a clearer definition of customer, a clearer definition of employee, and by that I mean not having that every employee is a clone, looks the same, talks the same, and smells the same. Far from that, but the employees should have a commonality of values which is consistent with the organization's values, and they should support the vision and mission of the organization. And if that's not there, one would have to question whether you've got the right employees. And similarly, it helps define the type of board members that you need. And we'll be looking more at that in detail as we go forward. But the importance is that the culture becomes a mirror of the organization and also becomes a very helpful tool in making sure that we have the right employees and the right board members involved. I wanted to give an example from 2 organizations which went through major culture change. One is in the UK, British Home Stores, a large retailer, and one was a bank in Kenya, hence the flag. Now what was different about these organizations is that British Home Stores, BHS, had 15,000 employees. It was 100 times bigger than the bank, which had 150 employees. BHS had 120 branches. The bank had 4 branches. BHS, the branches that they had were spread across the country. The Kenyan bank, they're all based in the capital city. So they're quite different in size and challenge, but they were both facing the need for culture change. In particular, BHS was an old-fashioned 50-year-old company and was rather stuck in its ways. It was bureaucratic, hierarchical, and top-down. The bank was family-owned. It was largely invisible, and it serviced its own community. The changes that were required were to actually, for BHS to compete effectively with Marks and Spencer's, the biggest retailer in the country, and for the bank to become visible and attract customers nationally and from different ethnic backgrounds, and not just the community that it had historically served. So there were two different organizations, both involved like yourselves in the retail space. In the case of BHS it was retail clothing, but in the case of the bank it was retail banking, very similar to banks and MFIs generally. So what happened to change the culture? Well, in the first instance with BHS, the chief executive was new. He came from America, and he started to come to board meetings wearing a t-shirt and jeans and sit on the floor and eat yogurt. This was a major cultural shock to the system. He came in and said, "Why are you all dressed like bankers? Either you are wrong or the clothes we're selling is wrong." And so what he did was he physically demonstrated that things were changing. And in a 6-month period, he brought in a clear value, vision, mission statement. He worked with staff. He brought in clear customer focus, and a third of head office disappeared. But as a result, we ended up with a new board and a new culture and a new direction. In comparison, the smaller entity in Kenya, a full staff questionnaire was undertaken and 100% response rate was received. This was the first time anybody had really asked the staff what they thought about the organization, how it was managed, and where it was going and what it was doing in the market. That feedback and the answers to those questionnaires, which were all done anonymously, was fed back to staff, and out of that came a new value statement, new mission, and new vision, a clear customer focus. Again, some staff were not comfortable with the new direction and the new culture of the organization, which was highly performance directed rather than just a job where people turned up every day, with a clear focus. And what was interesting is some previous employees who'd left in frustration actually came back. And again, as it relates to the board, new board members were introduced, and it was the board both of BHS and the new board of the bank in Kenya that were then going to safeguard, and having established what the clear culture and direction of the organization was, were going to safeguard that particular culture and hold both organizations true to the new direction. I'll now hand over to Jessica and Glynis in terms of the board's responsibility as it relates to a clear culture.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, afternoon, everybody. So to start our discussion about the role of the board in setting and embedding culture, I'd like to start by thinking about what we mean by organisational culture. So when we refer to culture or corporate culture, we're describing a set of values and a way of doing things that's implicitly understood by people working within the organisation. We often hear people talk about the way we see and do things round here. Organisations build up their culture over time through tradition, their history, their structure, and it gives an organisation a sense of identity, who we are, what we stand for, what we do. For employees, the culture will influence how they're rewarded, encouraged, promoted or criticised. The culture also determines the way in which the company relates to other parties or its stakeholders, and actually therefore is a key driver of the reputation of the institution. So if leaders want everyone in the organisation to behave according to these values, then they must be reflected in how the leaders behave and act. So the board chair can insist that all board colleagues honour this commitment at all times in their word and in their doing. So why do we care? So for microfinance institutions or an SME lender, for example, there may be many dimensions which together form the culture, including the balance of the social mission, the need for sustainability, profit to shareholders, the way the organisation works with its clients, its attitude to client protection, the way it treats its staff, its attitude to risk, and to financial sustainability and profit. So as we work through this session, I'd like to invite you to think about your own institution and how these themes play out for you. It's important that an institution's ambition or strategy is in line with its culture, which is reflected in the behaviours of leaders and in the incentives, systems and processes of the institution, so that the institution can achieve its strategy. If we want to foster, for example, a culture of innovation, but our leaders are micromanaging and they're intolerant of failure, then innovation isn't going to happen. And if the institution wants to achieve growth, but its incentives and behaviours actually reward risk-averse behaviour, then staff will behave in a risk-averse manner. So as the board and as senior leaders in the institution, we have the power to be able to influence this. So today, we're going to be discussing how the development and maintenance of an appropriate culture sits with the everyday working of the board and how you as leaders can start to address some of these questions. So, Peter, if I could have the next slide, please. So we'd like to articulate a 5-step process for how we think about an institution's leadership and how they can support the alignment of culture to the ambition of the institution. So we're going to look at, firstly, how we define the role of the board and board members in relation to culture and values, how we attract board members with the right skills and values, and Peter discussed this in the previous webinar as well when he was thinking about skills audits. How do we develop the skills of the board member? And how do we manage the performance of the board and individual members so that it's in line with the values and the culture? And then how do we renew the membership of the board? And we're going to discuss and bring some examples in about board rotation and succession planning. So on to the next slide to think about the purpose of the board really in respect to culture. So the purpose of the board overall, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, is to ensure the organisation's prosperity by directing its affairs while meeting the appropriate interests of its shareholders and relevant stakeholders. But actually, what is the purpose of the board in relation to values and culture? So when we think about the board's responsibility to establish and maintain vision, mission and values, those inform the culture and drive it. When we think about strategy and structure, then that's also going to underpin the culture. How the board delegates to the CEO and to management, and how the board exercises its accountability to shareholders. So each of these elements reflects the culture of the institution. So we need to think about how do the values match with the strategy, what behaviours does the structure drive, how does the board delegate and lead, and how is the institution perceived by external stakeholders. So if we think about defining, on the next slide, the role of the board in relation to culture, actually often in our work we find that this isn't specific, it's not been specified and included actually in what's expected overtly of board members. So it's important that the board members are clear about their responsibilities as a whole, but also those in relation to culture. And there are a number of ways that culture is reflected in this definition phase. So the values that the board wishes to embed in their behaviour and in the institution can be defined in terms of reference for the board and the board members. And thinking about the composition of the board in relation to its customers and its stakeholders. And we're going to think in a little bit about the diversity of board and the impact of that on effective decision making. It also can help to develop a clear terms of reference for the board, and Glynis is going to share a case later where she's helped to do this with one of our clients. And for these to include responsibilities in relation to culture. And the role descriptions or accountabilities of the chair and the members also need to take account of and set out the values that need to be espoused. So this first piece really is about saying, what do we want from our board members, and then how can we articulate it so that we increase the chance of us actually getting it. So I'd like to just hand over to Glynis now for our first case, where we're going to think about work to define the role of the board and board members.
Thank you, Jessica. So let's think about a case, and obviously we've fictionalised this to maintain confidentiality. So the institution that we worked with had experienced significant growth and today is completely differently positioned in the marketplace than where it was 5 years ago. A lead institution in its own country, and whilst there was provision for board rotation, so that was there, the selection of members was carried out by the chairman and other board members. So they would think through, they knew their own networks, they'd identify people who they thought might be good board members. So potential members were introduced to the board, references were checked, and the new members were elected. So it was a very good process in place. However, the outcome of this over 5 years was a board in which the majority of members had very similar backgrounds because they had been introduced by the current board members. So at the same time, the institution had repositioned itself in the marketplace and was carrying very different levels of risk, had a completely different client base as it moved into SME lending. So,
thank you, Glynis. So what we're thinking here actually is about how the institution had changed and was doing something very different, and the process of appointing board members through networks actually wasn't achieving the diversity of perspectives on the board that was required. So if we think about defining and moving back to defining some of the work, one of the first pieces that Glynis was supporting in this case was actually to define the terms of reference of the board and what was required of them. So Peter, if we could move on to the next slide. So when we think about attracting skills, attracting board members, then this is something that, that again Peter touched on in the last webinar. When we think about attraction, we're considering how do we identify and attract board members with the right skills and values to lead the institution. The alignment of values with those of the organisation is critically important because it's about having the skills to deliver against the role and its accountabilities for the institution now and in the future. So we need also to be thinking about the strategy at this time. So when we're making appointments, we need to consider the points set out here. What are the values of the applicant and the match? How will the new candidate contribute to diversity in the decision-making of the board? Are we applying a robust recruitment process to this? And actually, how are we inducting board members so that they know how we do it here? And if we think about issues around indebtedness and client protection, actually the values of the board are incredibly important in dictating the behaviours of staff all the way down the institution. So, Glynis, I wonder if you could share with us an example about some induction, thinking about induction.
Yeah, so newly appointed board members, directors, need an induction programme to help them to get up to speed as quickly as possible and to ensure that they lead in a way which is aligned with the culture. So the precise content obviously will vary from institution to institution, but there are some core elements such as discussion with the key executives, understanding the strategy, and really having a comprehensive introduction to the organisation. So in the case of our example institution, the induction consisted of reading the strategic plan, talking with other board members, attending a first meeting, but it also really was very clear on the requirements of board members, so what was expected. So a board member coming in knew what they were expected to do, and they also knew what expertise the institution was relying on them for, so that they were really clear about their role on the board and the time they would be required to commit, the commitment they would be required to make. And so all of that context setting, just as induction into any new role is important, is particularly critical for the good functioning of the board. So let's just take a look at the research on decision making as a way of thinking about the business impact of board diversity, or the lack of it, thinking about this board that actually ended up with a very sort of coherent and similar membership, and the issues that brought into place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And just before we move on to that detailed research, we'd just like to take a poll question. So if I hand back to you, Jessica, to administer the poll, please.
Great, excellent. And going to Glynis's last point there, we want to find out from you if you have any induction in place for board members. So again, this is a yes or no poll. And if you'd also like to share in the question or chat box, if you do have an induction, maybe some of the pieces that you include in there. So is it reading the strategic plan? What type of introduction do you have? Is it speaking to other board members? So that may take a little bit longer for people to type that into the chat box, so we may not get those before the end of the poll. But we would love to hear from you if you could share what induction you do have in place for board members going on. So we are again in a dead heat, 50-50% say yes, 50% say no, and we'll just wait another 5 seconds here. So if we want to see if anyone else is going to vote, we'll take just another couple seconds, and if we want to close it. Oh, and there we are. So 50% are saying yes. They do have an induction in place, and 50% are saying no. And for those that reported yes, I would encourage you to let us know what kind of induction you have in place. So please feel free to type that information into the chat box or the question box. And now I'll hand it back over to Jessica.
Brilliant, thank you, and thank you everyone for voting. It's really interesting, I think, to see the kind of the diversity of how board induction is looked at across our group. So something I'd like to share with you now is a piece of research around decision making primarily, and how the diversity of perspectives that we have on a board, for example, or any team, inform the discussion and the robustness of decisions that are made. So this study by Kellogg University compared decision making by diverse and non-diverse groups. So the diverse being the non-diverse being homogeneous, which is what they've used on the slide. So the non-diverse group made less accurate decisions, so they were 52% accurate compared with 75% accuracy of the diverse group. So non-diverse groups were not making as accurate decisions, but this non-diverse group thought that their group was working more effectively. So on a scale of 1 to 10, they scored themselves as 6.3, and the average of the diverse group scored themselves as 5.85. So they were making less accurate decisions, but they thought that they were doing better. So if we can move on to the next slide, Peter, then we get another perspective on this. So also, the non-diverse group had more confidence in their decision. They were 76% confident that they'd made the right decision, whereas diverse groups were only 71% confident. So what we see here is that actually diversity in decision-making groups gives us better decisions, but actually it can be a less comfortable process. So one of my colleagues uses the term an intellectual workout. So if you have a diverse team, then it's tougher to get to that decision, but what the research shows very clearly is that the decision that's made is far more robust. So here we see quite a strong argument for thinking about the diversity of perspectives that our different board members bring. So the identification of knowledge, skills and experience that you need on the board is a key responsibility of the chair and the board as a whole. And the board should also represent the perspectives of key stakeholders and be representative of its client base. So the composition of the board might represent the gender diversity of the client base, any ethnic diversity, and also the perspectives of investors and funders. And consideration should also be given to the skill sets required, as Glynis said in our example. So finance, credit, knowledge of the SME market, HR expertise, for example. And having these requirements clear in our definition phase will mean that when a new board member is to be appointed, maybe perhaps by an investor, then the chair will be ready to ask if the investor can provide a member with the skill set that the board actually needs at that point in its development. And there was also some similar research conducted recently by Women's World Banking, and they found a correlation between the diversity of the institution's governance and leadership and its ability to innovate in response to the needs of its clients. So actually diversity is a critical consideration if your strategy requires innovation. So a bit of food for thought there. So as we moved on to the next slide, I'd like us to think now about how we go about building skills. So how do you go about building the skills of your board members? And Glynis, I wonder if you could build on the case you introduced before in this aspect.
Sure. So in the case of the board we were discussing earlier, when the institution hit a crisis, the chair realised that they didn't have the breadth of expertise nor the capacity in terms of members' availability to deal with the situation. So the members weren't present, they weren't available to put the time in, and they didn't have the expertise. And it was at this stage that we became involved. So a number of things had happened. One of the things we observed was that this board had functioned well over a number of years, and board members were friendly with different members of staff, and the ways of operating, they had an observer who came to observe the board, and that observer, not a member of staff, one of the sponsors of the institution, also, would contribute to the board. They didn't just sit there as an observer. So all sorts of practices had evolved that led to a real lack of clarity of the function of the board and their relationships with staff and the role of the CEO. So the whole thing had become somewhat unclear. And so the first thing we did was to create a terms of reference for the board which clarified the role of the board and the responsibilities of the CEO, and in a sense enabled the institution to put things in the right place. And everybody agreed when they had that suddenly they could see where they'd have these confusions, and it really served to clarify that. And then we identified the breadth of skill sets and experience needed to work with the board to expand their membership. So this was looking at the clients that they serve, looking at the key stakeholders, and so they could look at executive and non-executive membership of the board to make sure that they had both the expertise that they need and the breadth of their stakeholders' perspectives represented in the board, within the board. So that together really has made an impact on how that board can actually move forward now with a quite different type of membership based on that work that was carried out. So Jessica, let me hand back to you now if I may.
Yeah, thank you, Glynis. And I think actually what perhaps is also interesting about that example is that it wasn't an easy solution, was it, Glynis? Actually, the relationships were highly complex, the situation was very sensitive, and so we're touching on the kind of the realities of the situations as well, and that it required really careful facilitation and negotiation to make sure that everyone came onto the same page and that a robust kind of understanding was undertaken. So if the board is to be effective, its members must be properly selected, organised and led. And Peter touched last time on best practice in terms of skills audits, which are really important in the last webinar. And Somebody's just mentioned that they'd like us to cite the Women's War Banking research, and absolutely we will be able to supply some information as to how you can access that after the webinar. So thank you for your interest in that. So another example is where you might want to think about looking for relevant governance programs to support the development of your board. You can think about a skills audit, you can think about consistent induction, you might want to think about using an independent consultant to come and think through with you some of these aspects, but also look for relevant governance training and ideally send all of the relevant people onto the same program so you all come back with a shared perspective. So thinking on to the next slide, Peter. But not only the financial performance and the strategic development, but also these softer cultural issues, so that the board has a clear understanding of its goals, its direction, and the ethos with which it wants to achieve these. So corporate and board performance both obviously need to be measured, and corporate measurement would need to be specific to the organisation and to its competitive strategy, and seen in the context of historic and sector information, and used to promote discussion and to decide actions. And as we've said before, it also needs to cover these softer cultural issues. So if the board is able to regularly focus on specific measures of their own performance and thinking and reflecting on this, the chair can facilitate this. So moving on to the next slide, Peter, we can think about some of the questions that you might ask if you're thinking of the performance of your own boards. So does the board work as a team? Do they lead and control the institution? Do they contribute valuably to the strategy and manage risks effectively? And are they capable of reacting well to a crisis? So in Glynis's example, actually when the crisis hit, what became apparent was that the board was not able to, and it wasn't able to act in a way that protected the institution's reputation with investors and with the public. So the board can ask itself some tough questions, actually, and be willing to give honest answers when it thinks about its performance in terms of these aspects. And picking up on the culture and the values and the consistency and the behaviours are extremely important in this self-reflection process. So thinking on to renewal of the membership of the board. On the next slide, please, Peter. When we think about board rotation and board renewal, we're considering rotation of board members and planning for succession. So, for example, it would be good practice to have a board rotation policy in place, which accounts for a rotation out perhaps after 3 years and perhaps a maximum period of tenure of 10 years. And these should be reviewed annually and plans made for upcoming rotations, as the lead time can be quite significant for recruiting the right board members and inducting them. So I wonder, Glynis, if you'd be able to share an example around board rotation and some of the consequences of having this in place or not having this in place.
Okay, so I think if you think about board rotation happening, so maybe 1 or 2 members of the board come off every 3 years, then effectively each year some people are coming off and new people are coming on. And the impact of that is to have the board constantly thinking about succession, constantly thinking about the skill sets that it needs, and constantly in a mode of recruitment, so that there's always that ongoing discussion. So as the institution changes and grows, then actually the board also can change to reflect that. So that rotation is very healthy. If that doesn't happen, a number of consequences can arise. One of them being that the institution almost outgrows, as in the first example, outgrows the capacity of the board. So as an institution grows and develops, maybe at the instigation of its CEO and some of its investors, then other members of the board may lag behind and not really bring that critical overview that the board should bring in order to really ensure appropriate governance. So this is actually really important because carried out well, it drives that continuous change and refreshing in relation to the changes in the institution itself.
Mm-hmm. And so thinking back on our poll question around succession planning, I wonder, Jessica, if you could just give us the results around the succession planning poll again.
We had about a 57% said that they do have succession planning, and then the rest do not at this point in time.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
So I wonder, Glynis, if you could, thinking about succession, you've obviously talked about that a little bit in the first example. In the previous webinar and also in the questions that were raised in Istanbul, rotation in family boards was picked up particularly as something for us to think about that can be quite challenging. And I wonder if you could talk to that point for a moment or two, please.
Sure. So I think the risk with family boards is that, of course, you don't have rotation because typically the founder members will, and often then, you know, their children and their grandchildren will be on that board and taking key seats on that board. And so it's quite difficult to get this, it can be quite difficult to get this diversity that we're talking about and diversity of approach. Now there's a huge strength also because there is a long-term commitment to the vision and mission, and so there's a sustainability and a longevity about family-run institutions as well, which is a very strong positive. So thinking from the point of view of the family, one of the institutions that we know well, when they saw this data on diversity, actually took the decision to consciously extend their board membership. So they did have non-family members on the board, of course, but they took a conscious decision to broaden their board and to actually rotate amongst the family members themselves to bring about this, the diversity that was needed. If you think about the perspective of non-family members of a board, then that can actually be quite difficult depending on the role that the family takes. And so one of the ways in which a non-family member of a board can start to put forward the possibility of functioning well is to actually present data like this, or is to encourage family members to go on board governance training programs. And as Jessica said earlier, ideally everyone goes on the same program, so there's a possibility of discussing, not necessarily at the same time, but you know, there's a consistency and a possibility of discussing and adopting the same views. So actually it requires some skills sometimes to present the possibility of thinking about governance when actually the board is a family board, but nevertheless it is very important for the future of the institution. So that is often the lever that will encourage family members to think more widely if it can be well presented.
Thank you, Glynis. Okay, so as we draw to the end of this initial kind of thought piece and before we open up for questions, I just wanted to briefly summarise, so if we move on to the next slide, Peter. So we've stepped through these 5 stages of how we can think about introducing this question around culture to the board. How do we define what's required in the board members and of the board? How do we attract the right kinds of board members, the right mix of skills and views? And how do we then build the skills of the board and manage the performance of the board, specifically in relation to culture and values? And then how do we think about renewing the membership of the board in terms of rotation and succession planning? So hopefully that's given you some ideas for how you might start this conversation, which, as Glynis says, is not always an easy conversation to start, and it does take some skill. But here are some areas where we might think about starting to introduce this as a concept to an established board. So governance ultimately is about creating a framework to enable companies to operate within their margins or in accordance with their principles, and that the principles are recognised and understood by their shareholders and stakeholders. And it's about complying with structural requirements, and where it doesn't, to give convincing explanations as to why. But in the end, we have to come back to the purpose of the board and its leadership role in creating prosperity. So the leadership can only come about if the directors, and individually and collectively, are of the appropriate calibre with the necessary skills and experience to contribute effectively to this decision-making process. So thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to share some of our thoughts with you. And now I think I'd like to hand back to Peter and Jessica to take the questions section.
Thank you very much, Jessica and Dennis. If I could just conclude with a thought from Bob Garrett, who wrote the book The Fish Rots from the Head. He talks about board members and boards of organizations being, at best, diverse groups of individuals, but who are responsible for pointing the organization, be it an MFI or an SME bank or other organization, in the same direction. Those individuals do need to subscribe to the same organizational culture. It takes time for that job to be done well. But what he says is it must be done again and again. And that goes to the last point that Jessica was making about renewal. I don't think any board reaches a point of saying we've got there, we've arrived, we have now got good governance. I think the purpose of this webinar, the previous one and the one coming up in November, is really to say this is an ongoing learning process, and we can learn from each other, we can learn from the SBBN network, from the other participants in these webinars and forums, to improve the way we do things so that we can do them better. So with that thought, I'll hand over to Jessica and questions.
Great. Thank you so much. And we actually had a couple participants that were going to share their induction strategy. And so we have Alex. Alex, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Alex, so Alex is, do you want to share your institution and then also a little bit about your induction strategy?
Okay, thank you. I'm Alex from Post Bank Uganda. I'm the executive director here. Yes, we do carry out induction for our board members. First of all, from the start is that the board members are vetted for fit and proper by the regulator, the central bank. So from that background, they have some knowledge and skills about banking. But still, when they come in, we just try to organize one-on-one meetings with the heads of departments, senior management, so that they are taken through what the managers do in terms of their respective departments. And then the bank also organizes a formal training from the Institute of Corporate Governance to take them through the corporate governance issues and the way boards operate. So that's all is organized during the first quarter, so that by the time they meet with their fellow board members, they have some knowledge about the institution and also the corporate governance issues. It's also important to note that the term for the board members don't expire at the same time. So we always have one or two coming in at any given time, not the entire board coming and requiring induction at the same time. So I hope that's all I have to share for today. Jessica?
Thank you so much. And I'll let either Jessica or Peter or Glynis kind of respond in terms of, if you have any thoughts on what Alex just shared.
It's Glynis here. Can I come in? Alex, do you feel that all of those actions, which are demonstrations for governance, does that actually result in an effective board operation for you?
Yes, we try, I think it does, because we try to bring the new board member to be at par with the rest of his members on the board, so that when they go for the board meetings, they speak from the same level of knowledge in terms of how the institution is operating.
Yeah.
So we hope it's a very good way of getting the new members on board, so to bring them at level with their peers.
And
Okay.
Alex, maybe you can comment on how diverse is your board as a result of the process you've got?
Yes, Postbank is 100% government institution, so we report the Minister of Finance, and it's the Minister of Finance that appoints the board. It tries as much as possible to bring in people with experience in banking and also business, and by the mere fact that these people have to be first vetted by the central bank before they are brought on board, mean that they have the knowledge and the experience to drive the business and banking in general. So they are all appointed by the Minister of Finance, but with different skills, different experiences. But what is important is that at least they are vetted by the central bank.
Yeah, I mean, my observation is, in terms of your induction process, that sounds to me very sensible, and for the 47% of our participants that don't do an induction process, I don't think it's too onerous to actually introduce, and actually it's in the interest of both new board members and the performance of the board to follow those kind of very simple, straightforward induction programs. Jessica, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. We appreciate it. I'm going to put you back on, I'm going to put you back on mute now. And if anyone else would like to share their induction process or have any specific questions, now is the time to post those questions. We don't have to unmute you. I can ask those questions directly. We can keep it anonymous. So please feel free to post those questions. And one thing I wanted to go back to was this challenge of diversity and these perceived challenges. This seems like a very tough piece to work out. And maybe Jessica, Glynis, you can both share a little bit more about these challenges and why this comes up, and maybe why institutions perceive that they're doing better, when they have a less diverse board, and also what you mean by stronger performance as well. So maybe you can just go a little deeper into those couple of slides.
Of course, yeah. So if you think about board decision making, and if you're listening, then please think about your own board when we're talking about this. So if all the board members come from a similar background, we have a shared set of understandings about the world and how it works. So we don't have so many challenges, so many questions, so many people challenging assumptions, and so therefore it feels quite comfortable. We know what the terms of reference are, we know what we're talking about, we know how the board meeting goes, so it has some comfort to it. And often in those cases there's not a lot of dispute. So, so it's comfortable, it's easy. When we start to think about a more diverse board, then often there will be challenges to those things that we take for granted, because somebody else will come in with a very different perspective. And so this is why it seems strange to say, this, and I think this is why this research is so useful, is that although the meeting might feel more uncomfortable, actually the outcome may be very much better, because you're taking into account the views not just of us, this group who all have the same view, but a broader set of views. So then if you think about the potential stakeholders for an institution, and the skill sets needed, then obviously you need board members with the perspective of understanding the particular types of lending or the particular client base that the institution is working in. You may want representatives from some of the communities that the institution is serving. You may want to have, obviously the normal skill sets of financial management, risk management, all those skill sets, of course. You may want somebody who understands organisation development, and you may want to have members who reflect the diversity of the wider stakeholder group, so thinking who those stakeholders are. Now, when you bring all those people together, they may have widely differing views. So the meetings may not be so easy, but the fact that you've taken into account those views actually really enables the performance of the board to be far more effective, because the decisions are much sounder. And if you think about many microfinance institutions serving often a large percentage of women clients, then as time goes on, the number of women on boards has actually been decreasing at the same time as the client representation has stayed constant or may have grown. So actually having the voices of women on the board mean that that perspective of the client is more represented than if it was, a male-dominated board and an institution that has largely women clients, for example. I'm presenting that as an extreme, obviously. So I don't know whether that gives you some of those parameters, Jessica, but I think also in terms of performance, which was the other part of your question, then measuring both the financial performance and the social performance of the institution where that commitment is there, and the ability of the board to contribute to that. So how has the board really managed to maintain and contributed to that may be one of the ways in which the board would be evaluated, and the performance of the board can be considered. So the quality of the board's meetings would also be one of those parameters that you would consider in a regular annual board review or board appraisal of the way we're working. So how well did we work? Did we have diverse views? Did we have heated discussion? A board that never has heated discussion, may be very comfortable to be in, but actually may not be making the best decisions.
Thank you, Glynis. And I see that we've got a question from Julie. So I wonder, Jessica, if you'd like to unmute Julie so that she can ask her question.
Perfect. Julie, you are unmuted. So
thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So I actually have two questions, if you don't mind. This is a great seminar. Thank you. And the first question I was wondering is how these recommendations differ from what you would recommend from any other financial institution or company in terms of how different it is because they're either small business banking or MFIs or institutions seeking social impact. And my second question is for MFI or small business banking networks that fill their boards by practice with network members, either staff from headquarters or staff from their other affiliate banks in other countries. Do you see that as positive or negative? Positive that there might be a more cohesive or coherent culture, but negative that it may lack diversity, although they may be from different countries. So I would love to hear your thoughts on those two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. So perhaps if I take the first one and then Glynis could comment on the second one. So from my perspective, I think that this kind of framework really that we've outlined can apply similarly for any type of financial institution, or including those with different product or focus and those with a social mission. I think where it differs is what is the culture and the values and the mission and the strategy that we're kind of plugging into this framework, because those of course will be very different depending on whether there's a social mission for the organisation, whether they're focusing on SME lending, whether they're focusing on developing products for women, where they're seeking and how they're seeking to innovate. I think from my perspective, having those things clear in terms of the strategy of the organisation, the institution, and then feeding them through into what's expected of the board and the values and the culture, that's how we get those differentials into this framework. But the framework, from my perspective, I think probably stands across different institution types. Glynis, what do you think about that?
I think we're talking about the principles of good governance, of course. Yes. So that would apply across any institution. I think one of the other peculiarities for microfinance institutions and small business banking is really the level of risk in the environment and the level of risk in relation to new product development. So whereas a larger, more established financial institution may not be innovating in quite the same way that small microfinance and small bank, SME lenders do, I think moving into SME lending presents a certain level of risk that the institution can manage, and the whole issue of the potential of over-indebtedness in the context, in the environment, which may not be to do with the institution itself, but within the environment. Those issues really create certain tensions for board members, but we are talking about the standard issues of good governance in the majority of what we're saying. That balancing of the social and financial mission also, as Jessica said, is also really a characteristic of these types of institution, which may not be present in others. And then to move on to your question about networks, I think this is a really good question. So I was just sort of thinking about the networks that that we know well, and I would say a couple of things here. I think firstly, that can tend to be one of those cosy environments where the network itself has its culture, its ways of working, and so sometimes that challenging may not be there. I think that we've seen that in some contexts that involvement of network members can mean that the board is focused on how does this institution perform in the context of our network as a whole. So in other words, the network's own values or agenda or strategy that are being pursued, and rightly so, obviously as a stakeholder, nothing wrong with that, unless it's unbalanced. And what I mean by that is that when I think about those boards, sometimes they don't have that visibility of the client and the client context in the unique national context or the context of the individual institution, precisely because they have got that broader network context but not so much understanding of the local context, and then that can skew the board's decision making. So I would think that there's not a right answer to this, of course, but still that question of diversity, which voices are not represented, might be one of the key questions to go forward. It just helps to think, do we need somebody else that represents a different perspective to challenge some of our thinking in the local context?
Okay. And we're drawing towards the end of time, so I would just like to take maybe a final question from Sarah. Jessica, I wonder if you could unmute Sarah so that she can ask her question.
Yes, Sarah, you are unmuted, so please proceed.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Thank you, and thank you very much for such an interesting discussion. I have been working in the banking investment space for the last 15 or so years. My particular question is something that we come across a lot when investing, is that in many of our markets there is a requirement that board members rotate after a certain number of years and re-elected, particularly at the chairman level. They are told that there's a finite number of years that they can be in that position. I'd like to understand from you if you know of any evidence or have got any ideas of best practice as to what the most optimal lifespan of an NED to really be effective on any board is, especially bearing in mind some of the comments you've made earlier around how important renewal is on a board, but also how important consistency is. So I think this is a constant challenge for institutions, and I'd love to hear your perspective.
Okay, perhaps I could just answer this first, and then Peter, you may also want to comment. So I think this is a really valuable question and an important one. So you're absolutely right. That continuity, and that's continuity of practice, of ways of behaving, of good governance, it does depend on continuity of board membership. And obviously this changes is different from board to board, but very many boards have 3-year terms, and a member can serve 2 or 3 3-year terms, and then they have to step off. So actually 2 3-year terms gives 6 years. That's a good solid length of time for somebody to contribute to a board. And what you wouldn't want to have, though, is everybody staying on for 6 years. So if people are automatically re-elected, then you get almost too much consistency. So continuity. So having some new members, a mix really of stability and some new members would seem to be ideal and to work well. And I know that's not a precise answer, but it does seem that you're absolutely right, that balance needs to be considered. Peter, do you want to comment on this?
Well, in respect of the question of best practice, what's interesting is in the UK at the moment, the new rules coming in for governance here does actually require financial institutions in particular to not have board members for more than 10 years. And if they are longer than 10 years, then in their annual reports they have to justify why any individual is maintaining a position on a board for longer than that 10-year period. So that seems to be the best practice that seem to be the right one to adopt in a UK situation. I do also think it's worth adding that it is possible for somebody to be the chairman role. We haven't really focused on explicitly, but it is a fundamental position of the way the board operates, the role of the board chairman, and the danger is that if the board chairman is there for too long, they may be less effective going forward. So I think there's an interplay here between the board chair and the deputy chair, and I think what you might find could be an improvement to most boards is where they think clearly through the next 10 to 15 years of the current composition and who's likely to be the chair and the next deputy chair, and possibly rotate those positions more frequently than currently happens. Those would be my comments. The other thing I would add to Sarah's question is, and it relates to the previous question from Julie, on the international diversification of board membership. I do think it's an interesting thing that where an organisation is expanding cross-border, have they looked at their board composition to say, have we got international presence or cross-border presence on the group board to make sure that we are diverse in terms of our diverse geographical operations? And if it's a homogeneous board at that group level, it may actually be making inaccurate and ineffective decisions because it lacks, as it were, international diversity. Back to you, Jessica.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to invite you to participate in our SBBN LinkedIn group. We'll do a follow-up discussion there, so please do join our group, and we'd ask that you participate within that discussion as well, and we'll have a question posted over the next week. So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much to all of our participants and to our excellent presenters, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. So thank you so much.